This summary is of the article Teaching Children with Autism to Respond to Disguised Mands from the Fall 2017 Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. Children with autism spectrum disorder often have difficulty inferring the private events of others, including private verbal behavior, private emotional responses, and private establishing operations, often referred to as perspective taking by the general psychological community. Children with ASD also have difficulty responding to disguised mands. Skinner's description of the disguised mand is a verbal behavior wherein the speaker's mand directly describes neither its reinforcer nor the corresponding establishing operations. Appropriate responding to disguised mands is required for successful social interactions, making it a social skill worth teaching to children with ASD. We used a non-concurrent multiple baseline across participants design to investigate the effects of a multiple exemplar training package consisting of rules, role play, and feedback for teaching 3 boys with ASD to respond to disguised mands. The intervention was effective and generalization to novel disguised mands and people was observed. Previous research has taught children with cognitive impairments to respond to idioms. Participants learned to identify idioms in pictures, and maintenance was observed for 3 of the participants. Persicki et al. 2013 used a multiple exemplar training package consisting of rules and feedback to teach listener behavior in response to metaphors to children with ASD. Participants were given rules to identify features of an object and the features of the metaphor. Then they were taught to identify those features that were the same. For example, in a story about a boy who always wore yellow, stayed up late at night, and ran really quickly, participants were taught to identify which of those features was consistent with someone saying, "He is a race car." Participants were trained to respond to multiple exemplars of metaphors until they were able to solve novel metaphors for which they had never received training. Persicki et al. 2013 used a multiple exemplar training package consisting of rules and feedback to teach children with ASD appropriate listener responding to sarcasm. Disguised mands are responses that are under the control of an establishing operation and a discriminative stimulus, but the response does not specify the reinforcing consequence. For example, saying, "Those cookies look good," may be controlled by deprivation from cookies and the presence of a listener, but the topography of the response does not specify that access to cookies is the reinforcer. Disguised mands may be shaped by a verbal community in which mands that specify the reinforcing consequence are punished and disguised mands are reinforced. For example, in some verbal communities, observers, such as parents, may punish specific mands directed toward unfamiliar people, which might be considered rude. By contrast, the verbal community may arrange contingencies that provoke reinforcement of disguised mands, such as a listener who offers a cookie to someone who says, "Those cookies look good," may be praised for being considerate. However, not all listeners may reinforce disguised mands. For example, a listener eating cookies might respond to the statement, "Those cookies look good," by simply saying, "Yes, they are." The speaker may be less likely to continue to mand toward this listener. The speaker may also be less likely to engage in other social interactions with a listener who does not reinforce disguised mands, and who may be described by the verbal community as inconsiderate. This study had 3 participants, all with a diagnosis of autism. Participants ranged in age from 9 to 13 years old. All participants failed to respond to disguised mands, but communicated in full sentences and had repertoires of listener behavior, rule-governed behavior, echoics, mands, tacts, and introverbals, as well as a history of learning via role play, requiring a sequence of up to 4 introverbals. Sessions were conducted in various locations of the participant's home, including outside, and at an amusement park. The purpose of the current study was to teach children with ASD a generalized repertoire of responding to disguised mands, such that they would be able to respond to novel, untrained disguised mands. During baseline, the therapist presented 5 different disguised mands randomly selected from a list of 20. After 30 seconds had elapsed from the delivery of the disguised mand, or the participant had made a response to the disguised mand. Whichever occurred first, the trial ended. No feedback was provided for incorrect responses or failure to respond to the disguised mand. To avoid exposing appropriate responding to extinction, if participants responded correctly to the disguised mand, the therapist responded to the questions about the mand and said thank you if the participant obtained the item. Disguised mands were presented approximately every 5 to 10 minutes during downtime, breaks, intertrial intervals of other lessons, over the course of each participant's regularly scheduled therapy sessions. The same disguised mand was not repeated until all 20 had been presented. Intervention included pre-training and training. During pre-training, the therapist provided the rule. Sometimes when a person wants something, they give hints about what they want instead of just asking for it. For example, if I was lying down on the floor and wanted a pillow, I might say to you, "This isn't very comfortable with my head just lying on the floor." What I'm really saying is, "Can I have a pillow?" So you should say something like, "Do you want a pillow?" and then give me a pillow if I say yes. Then the scene was role-played and data were collected on correct responses. Following 2 consecutive correct responses during role-play, the therapist initiated the training phase. Pre-training only included the role-play example with the pillow. During training, disguised mands were introduced 2 at a time into training and randomly selected from a second list of 20 disguised mands that were topographically different but functionally similar to the ones used in baseline. At the start of each session, the therapist gave the rule: when we're together today, people will make hints about things that they want, and you will have to ask if they want it and then get it for them if they say yes. The therapist rotated the 2 exemplars semi-randomly during the 10 trial session. The therapist did not present the same exemplar on more than 2 consecutive trials. Correct responses provided within 3 seconds of disguised mands were praised. If the participant did not respond within 3 seconds to the disguised mand, the therapist prompted, "What did the person say? What do you think he or she wants? Okay, then ask the person." Contingent upon 70% accuracy during a session in which 2 disguised mands were rotated, one of the existing therapists added 2 more disguised mands to the rotation in the next session, for a total of 4 disguised mands being presented semi-randomly across the 10 trial session. This process continued wherein 2 more disguised mands were added to the rotation in the subsequent session each time 70% accuracy during a session was achieved within the current rotation list. Each time 2 new disguised mands were added to the rotation, the first trial during which they were presented was considered a test for generalization across stimuli, and responses to these trials were graphed on a separate data path labeled first trial probes. When participant responding reached 80% correct for 2 consecutive sessions, regardless of the number of disguised mands in the rotation list, the rule provided at the beginning of session was discontinued, and only a 3-second prompt delay was included in training. Mastery was defined as 3 consecutive sessions with at least 80% correct responding on all trials and 100% correct responding on the first trial generalization probes. Following mastery, a probe session using baseline procedures was conducted with a novel person who was not present during baseline or training. Figure 1 displays the percent of correct responses to disguised mands for Nick, top panel, Musa, middle panel, and Drew, bottom panel. Although some correct responding occurred in baseline, consistent correct performance was not associated with any of the disguised mands. Nick responded correctly during 20% of trials in baseline sessions. During training, there was an immediate increase in correct responses to training exemplars and a gradual increase in correct responses to first trial generalization probes. The mastery criterion was met in 10 sessions after 12 exemplars were trained. During the novel person probe and post-training sessions, Nick responded with 100% accuracy. Musa responded correctly during 0% of trials in 6 of 7 baseline sessions, including one conducted at an amusement park. During training, there was an immediate increase in correct responding to training exemplars and first trial generalization probes. Although deprivation from food and touch were not targeted in intervention, Musa responded to these MOs with 100% accuracy during post-training. The mastery criterion was met in 5 sessions after 6 exemplars were trained. During the novel person probe and post-training sessions, Musa responded with 80% or greater accuracy, including while at an amusement park. During baseline, Drew responded correctly during 0 to 40% of trials in all sessions. During training, there was an immediate increase in correct responding to training exemplars and first trial generalization probes. The mastery criterion was met in 9 sessions after 12 exemplars were trained. During the novel person probe and post-training sessions, Drew responded with 80% or greater accuracy. A multiple exemplar training package consisting of rules, role play, and feedback was effective in teaching participants to respond to disguised mands, and this skill generalized to novel disguised mands and people for all participants and a novel community location for one participant. Because disguised mands do not directly describe their reinforcer, for the listener to respond effectively, he or she must infer the relevant establishing operation for the speaker's behavior to provide the reinforcing consequence. Skinner's analysis of how individuals learn to tact private events is relevant because that is essentially what listeners of disguised mands may need to do: identify and respond effectively to others' private events, which by definition one cannot respond to directly. Skinner suggested that children learn to respond to private events, which they cannot directly contact, by learning to respond to overt stimuli that are often correlated with those private events. For example, upon seeing the overt stimulus of someone crying, a child might be taught to say the person has a private event of feeling sad. Just as in other situations involving private events, responding to disguised mands includes consideration of an overt stimulus, the stimulus produced by the speaker's disguised mand, and some private events of the speaker that the listener cannot directly contact, but must infer from the overt stimuli available. Particular characteristics of this study may limit the external validity of the study. That is, it may be difficult for future researchers to identify whether the procedures used in the current study are applicable to many individuals with ASD. Although participants were described as having well-developed verbal repertoires and prior exposure to successful training via role play, it remains unclear whether there are prerequisite skills that are necessary for participants to respond appropriately to disguised mands during the training procedure. Researchers may want to investigate prerequisite skills for successful outcomes during non-literal language training. For more information or a full references list, please access the article directly in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, Volume 50.